So my name is Paul Young, and I serve as the president of Downtown Memphis Commission. Really excited to be here today with this illustrious panel and talk through how getting the rising tide to lift all Memphis neighborhoods should be our goal. And looking at some of the recent flood of federal, state, and local investment in our community, and looking at some of the historical patterns. And we're just going to have a very dynamic dialogue about that. So as we continue to wait for Juanita to get unmuted, I'm going to ask our panelists to just quickly introduce themselves and what they do. And then if Juanita can't get going, then we will just dive right in and we'll bring Juanita in at the end. So I'm going to start with Brett. Why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi there. So good to be with you all today. I'm Brett Theodos. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization. We are based in DC.
Great. Thank you for being with us today, Brett. Very excited to have you. Steve, you want to introduce yourself? I know you're having camera issues, but if you can unmute, that would be great.
Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Barlow. I'm the Director of Neighborhood Preservation Incorporated in Memphis, Tennessee. We've been a part of the city and county eviction response from the CARES Act days in 2020 and into the Emergency Rental Assistance Program in 2021. We're also very active in networking, policy, and innovation responses to blighted properties in the Memphis and Shelby County area. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Steve. And then last but not least, one of my favorite people in the world, and I've known her since I was born. Why don't you introduce yourself, Ms. Dorcas Griffin?
That was such an introduction. Thank you, Paul Young. For those, my name is Dorcas Young Griffin, and I'm the director of the Division of Community Services for Shelby County Government. Community Services is our human and social services arm of county government. So we find ourselves involved in all matters related to housing, related to housing stability efforts. So that's things like food, transportation, mental health, everything you can think of. And I just want to say this because I'm sure it'll come up in our conversation as we talk about some of the things that we've been able to do here locally. I appreciate Paul Young, who is my younger, less good-looking brother, for moderating this session, and really excited to be here today. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So Juanita, I know you can't introduce yourself right now because you're still muted, but I will just say Juanita is an amazing individual. She worked with us at HCD during my time there, and then she's just recently moved over to THDA, another amazing partner agency in the housing space, and she's a real estate industry advisor for West Tennessee, and so really excited to see her here. So Juanita, if you can try to log out and log back in, or try and come back into the session. I've seen that work in other panels, and then I'll bring you back in towards the end so you can say a few words. So in the meantime, I think we'll just dive right in to this session. And so in order to set a little bit of context, I'd love to have Brett talk about some of the research that he's done recently regarding Memphis and investments in community development in Memphis over the past few years. And so Brett, I'm gonna turn it over to you for about 7 minutes to kick us off, and then we're gonna make it a dynamic discussion, and I'll bring Dorcas and Steve in.
Great, happy to set the stage a little bit. I know we're going to be talking about ERAP and all of the really dynamic and really big resources that are flowing there. But to set the stage, provide a little context about where Memphis is at, where it's coming from, and just help compare it to some other cities. I'm going to share some data that we've been working up over the past few years. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? All right. So Memphis, capital flows. So when we look at Memphis versus the top 100 cities across the US, Memphis weighs in at 96th in terms of capital flows per household. So the city has struggled over several years to access resources. And these are resources that come through from the private sector, from what we call the mission sector, like community development financial institutions or CDFIs, and also through the public sector. So we take this look across different dimensions, and some of them are that we can look, for example, at specific investment types or asset classes. So single family housing, lending activity. Memphis is also very close to the bottom among the largest cities per household at 95th. A similar story emerges for multifamily lending. So these are loans to developers to build apartment buildings or condominium rooms. So similar story emerging there in terms of how much capital Memphis is accessing relative to its peer cities. And that plays out across space, as you all already know. And so what you can see is where capital is flowing the most and where it's not. And so it's flowing most centrally to downtown and some of the neighborhoods that merge to the east. And this, again, is a combination of a whole range of different industrial, small business, multifamily, single family, and other investment types. It's worth noting that well, these disparities make the dark blue look like they're accessing a lot of money. Compared to other cities, those levels are still lower. But it also illustrates that the parts of the city to the north and south are really, really struggling to access investment.
Kelly, put you back up.
And what we understand and know is that that very much maps onto racial segregation patterns into the city. And so the map of racial composition actually looks quite a bit like the map of where investment is going into the city. And we can quantify that. So for example, we can look at the amount of investment going to the median majority white census tract in Memphis, roughly $9,000. In contrast, the median majority black census tract in Memphis, roughly, let's call it $1,700. So several X multiple that we're seeing in terms of the disparities that are emerging. And a similar trend if we look at poverty levels within census tracts. So what this starts to convey is that capital access is generally a challenge in Memphis. It is especially a challenge in specific neighborhoods, most notably majority black and high poverty communities. And so what about all of this investment that's flowing? And is the federal government a big part, a little part? Where do they play relative to the others? And partially what I want to convey is federal spending historically has been quite low. So this is called an area chart. So the size of these boxes convey how big each of these elements is. So these are single family loans. This is non-residential loans, things like grocery stores and nursing homes, office buildings, multifamily, small business, and here's federal as a small slice. Now, we did just have some historic unprecedented stimulus that we're going to be talking about, but it is to say, even if federal spending increases, it's really hard for it to overcome the disparities that we see in these other investment types because they're just so much bigger than the federal investment is. So that was my quick walkthrough. I want to be short for time. We have a report up on the web about Memphis and some other cities, but let me pause there and get the conversation going.
All right, thank you for that, Brett. So I want to bring in Dorcas and Steve. You guys have both been doing a lot of work in the city. The results that Brett just showed essentially said that we don't have enough money flowing into the neighborhoods that need it most. And I think for folks in Memphis, I don't think that's much of a surprise, particularly when we start talking about private capital going into those communities. So I'm gonna start. Steve, I'll start with you. Can you just talk a little bit about what we've seen or what you've seen from your space and where you sit at Neighborhood Preservation Inc. Happening in the community over the past year and a half during the pandemic, and what things have we been able to do?
Sure. Well, you're right. It is no surprise that we are short on capital for the needs of neighborhoods in Memphis. The the neighborhood challenges in Memphis, since the pandemic, have been, overwhelming to everybody. The human needs, the urgent housing needs, the communication and connection needs, and all of that ties to the capital needs. And so, beginning in 2020, there started to be a federal response to the challenges that the pandemic created, often housing related. So one of the things I had a lot of conversations with, with friends who are in the homeless services provision space, or the affordable housing space, or even community engagement, community organizing space, was, everybody was lost because nothing we did was, everybody knows this, but we've all experienced it. This was something we never even tried to do before. And so, but the encouraging thing that happened in 2020 was we began to see the kind of federal investments that many of us in the community development world nationally in the U.S. have been advocating for a long time. We need a whole lot of federal investment in our neighborhoods, especially in our high poverty neighborhoods that are historically disinvested, by design, really. So the opportunity of the federal dollars became something that many of us in community development, in the advocacy space, got very interested in. What can we do to advocate for the dollars to go to the right place? One of the ways that NPI, my organization, and I personally, and my team, and many of our partner agencies who do similar work in affordable housing and community development in Memphis, one of the spaces we found that we had a natural place to provide some guidance and some support and some structure was in the emergency rental relief and eviction prevention space. So we had historically, as a policy advocacy organization, worked a whole lot with local landlords on laws and ordinances and code enforcement issues. We had worked historically for many years with advocates in the tenants' rights and the quality housing space, and so we were in a good place to bring together people. We're kind of a facilitator type of an organization, a collaborator type of an organization to start with. And so we found an opportunity to plug in that space. And so I think part of the reason that I'm here today is just to sort of talk about the role of the community organizer agencies, the neighborhood-based agencies, the foundations, and the nonprofit partners who found themselves in a new relationship with unprecedented amounts of money to do the kind of stuff we've been advocating for, and to try to find ways to work together towards solutions in a pandemic. So I'll stop in just one second, but I guess what I'll say is that housing became such a core issue because we couldn't let people get kicked on the street because that was a pandemic risk. We couldn't let people who had been homeless stay outside. We had to find solutions, and those solutions cost money. And finally, the way that I felt, and many I think felt, was finally the federal government is providing the kind of support for this that we've always thought was needed. And so we better jump in, and we better show that we know what the heck we're doing, so that we can prove that when they do give us a lot of money, we know what to do with it, and we can make it work, and we can get results that are longer lasting. One of the things we all talked about in the early days of planning how to use pandemic relief funds and then later emergency rental assistance program funds was that we need to find a way to demonstrate that there are effective solutions that money can help solve to these chronic housing problems in our community, so that hopefully long term we would be in a better position to provide those solutions.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for giving some context. So Steve talked a lot about some of the challenges that we've been experiencing, Dorcas, and he talked about some of the solutions that we've been coming up with. But Dorcas, I'd like for you to talk specifics and talk about some of the programs that were born as a result of this flood of capital that many of us that have been working in the community development space have been thirsty for many years. Over the past year and a half, we've seen quite a bit of it. So I'd love for you to talk specifically about some of the programs that have come about and what some of the benefits and challenges of implementing those programs have been.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I am definitely going to answer your question, but I do think a benefit, I'm going to jump to a benefit. I think that a benefit of all of this mess that we've been in the last year, more than a year, 18 months, has been that it has forced us as a community to really look at issues on a spectrum, right? So for a lot of time, I can speak to this because I know it. When you were in the seat at the city, you were across the street, literally, and we couldn't get closer than being brother and sister. And we're completely disconnected from the programming that the two of us were doing. And you just wonder, like, how can that be? But it has been very easy to do things. And I feel like silo is like one of the most overused words, but I don't know another word. We have worked in silos so long that is just how we've operated. I will say that through COVID, we have been forced to recognize just how we're all interconnected. And it's forced us to look at the issue of housing stability in particular on a spectrum, right? Not to just say that my lane is working to get those that are unhoused housed, but it also is to keep those folks that are currently in a home stably housed. And so lots of programming has been birthed from us just understanding that we have to address the continuum. We'll talk a lot, I'm sure, because our experience has really been being knee deep in this almost $90 million that we have available to us locally for our emergency rent and utility assistance program. But that's not all the work that's happened. Back last year, when we were able to secure CARES dollars for both the city and the county, you heard earlier about investments that were made in expanding our ability to address some of the needs of our unsheltered folks. So Collins Chapel, and just having a place where people who are experiencing homelessness can recuperate, was birthed out of its actual existence was helped by CARES dollars. There had always been a desire to do it, but we didn't necessarily know where the funding was coming. So that's one program piece. We also initiated very quickly to get people who did not have anywhere to go, because our shelters, of course, were full and had to be mindful of social distancing. We were able to quickly mobilize with partners, both the city and county, to place people in non-congregate options. Lots of hotels, but there were other options as well. And so that was birthed there. And of course, again, we'll talk a lot about our ERAP program and just how we came together very early on as a city and county and said, hey, it makes no sense to have this type of investment in us to run two separate programs. We very well could have said, city run yours, county run yours. And I'll tell you, it has been a challenge to be collaborative, but it's the right thing to do for our residents. And so I think lots of great things have happened. Paul, I may be leading us to a question, but I will say that, I am an idealist, so I believe that we have started some things that we need to continue, but I can't say that it hasn't been challenging, right? Sometimes it is easier to get in your own box and just spend the money. I think one of the biggest challenges is, you appreciate all of the federal investment because we know we need it, but it doesn't come without strings, and it's strings that people, the average citizen never sees. And so you're constantly kind of pushed against the pressure of this absolute critical need of our residents, and trying to make sure that you're doing everything to keep this money secured for your residents. And it's always a dance, but it's a worthy dance. And I think it's one that Shelby County and the city are committed to.
Amen. Amen on that. And I just want to piggyback on some of the things you said, because obviously I was around during the establishment of many of those programs. And Steve, I'm gonna circle back to you with a question, but just wanted to point out, when we start talking about the larger chunks of funds that came from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, I think that first tranche was announced like December 18th, and by March 1st, we were opening up for applications. I mean, that is warp speed in government time, and so I think the team should be applauded for all of the work and effort that went into getting these dollars out, and how the team is performing in getting those dollars out the door. Because like you said, most people don't necessarily know some of the strings that come along with it, and what it takes to actually get applicants to be able to have the right documents to attach to the file, so that you have all of that when the federal government comes back and does their audit. Steve, I was just going to piggyback on one of the points that Dorcas made, and I think it would be great for you to elaborate on one of the earlier parts of the pandemic when we started the Eviction Settlement Fund, because I think that was really an innovative approach to be able to keep those in their homes, and it also provided a benefit to those landlords. So Steve, why don't you just talk a little bit about the Eviction Settlement Fund and the work that was done collaboratively between the city, county, and NPI on that?
Sure. Yes, it was a very exciting time to be in this space. Overwhelming in a sense. The courts were closed when we first started talking about using some CARES Act dollars. The courts were closed because of the pandemic. There were no active evictions, but we knew that the state Supreme Court was going to eventually open the courts back up. So we started to formulate a program to use $1.4 million was the plan, a portion each from the city and the county. And the partnerships, which I mentioned earlier, that Neighborhood Preservation Inc. already had in place with organizations like Memphis Area Legal Services, MIFA, United Housing, and the law school at the University of Memphis, were something that we could go and draw from. And of course, we had some relationships, some existing contractual relationships, and some collaborative partnerships that did not involve funding, with some of the city and county agencies, just advocacy kind of, citywide staying in touch kind of stuff. And so we said, what can we do about evictions? Paul and Dorcas went to the city council and the county commission and got $1.4 million set aside out of CARES Act dollars for eviction prevention. The first thing we did was approach landlords, and we had a huge all-call to landlords who wanted to talk, and we said, what could we do to help prevent evictions? Tried to collect information from them. The next thing we did was we reached out to the local eviction court judges, and we asked them what they thought was happening, what they thought would be needed. Paul and Dorcas were both there on calls with the judges, on calls with the landlords. And then we also had the all-call to the social service providers who we thought were in a position to jump right in and play a role. And what we put together was the Eviction Settlement Program, which took thousands of applications over about a 5-month period, and assisted over 2,000 families to prevent evictions with $1.8 million. We ended up adding another $400,000 that was unexpended in other areas for eviction prevention. And so that's 2,000 plus households who did not get evicted between June and December of 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. Couple of the innovations there, we as a sort of a quality housing advocate at NPI, we were able to mandate that the landlords, upon receiving the funds, would guarantee that they would not, to guarantee that the house was in good condition, and that if it wasn't, that they would have to give the money back. We had them agree to not just to accept the money and allow the tenant to stay, but to actually dismiss the eviction case altogether, so that it would disappear from the record, which is a big deal for a tenant who's faced eviction. And we were able to build a relationship with the law school, so that, and with volunteer attorneys, that was another exciting part of the program. We had about 30 to 50 volunteer attorneys who were negotiating settlements on behalf of tenants facing eviction for free. They weren't charging for their services, and that was all coordinated through leadership of the Memphis Area Legal Services and the law school. Some of the professors in the clinical program there, and some law students there. So we just came up with a creative, innovative program. One of the key things that we needed and that we got from the government partners was flexibility, because we needed to move fast. And so I'll give one example of that. I remember a call with Dorcas in the summer of 2020 when we were trying to figure out how would we do payment, how would we get the payments done, and we spent about probably an hour and a half talking through what I needed and what she needed, and in order to make this work. And believe it or not, within a week or two of that call, we had a process in place, and we had checks going out within 10 days of agreements being signed. So they needed to be nimble. We needed to be concerned about what they needed to be concerned about, and compliance issues and regulatory issues that aren't normally my world. And she had to be sensitive to the speed that we had to operate with in order to have, credibility with landlords who we were saying, if you drop this eviction, we'll give you a check. They don't want to wait 90 days, so we had to figure out all of that sort of thing. And that's some of the thing that Dorcas referred to when she said that it's not easy, because that's not always smooth. It's not usually smooth. It's always bumpy. And so I think we've kind of learned how to just sort of roll with that bumpiness in the pursuit of our common goal.
Yeah, and Brent, I promise I'm coming back to you, but I want to turn to Dorcas really quick, because, when a lot of times we think about the complexity in government and how difficult it is to get programs like this out. But Dorcas, I know that you've been in the people business for quite a while, and I know you've had a number of personal conversations with different clients, and I just would love for you to speak to the impact of programs like this on the people.
So in one word, it's just hope, right? So yes, I am in the ivory tower of the Shelby County building. But every day, I have some intersection directly through being here, or even just because of my relationships with other people, with people that are in need of stability in their housing. I have talked to mothers who have had 5 children and had no idea how they were going to be able to stay stably housed for their children. And they're still every day trying to figure through, how do I continue? Your children think you're a superhero, no matter what. They have no idea, all of the burden that you have to keep a roof over their heads, literally. And so I know that literally this has been the saving grace for mothers with children. It has been the saving grace for men who, are trying to take care of their families. It has been the saving grace even for children that actually do know what's going on, even when we think they don't. And so, I think that's what keeps all of us in this work, right? It doesn't matter how difficult it is for us on the back end to do a treasury report, or to figure out how you're going to get a check processed through all of the rules you got to go through. At the end of the day, all of this is about the hope that it provides to residents in Shelby County. And I know that we have been able to do that. It hasn't been perfect, but there are over 8,000 households that are in Shelby County that have a little bit of hope and peace because of what has been able to be done so far. So I think it's real. I think in this work, I know it's a lot of people that are on here that are practitioners, right? And so you are doing work in the community, and sometimes it feels like you are just spinning your wheels. Paul and I do come from a religious background, and I know this is a government, run session, but in our faith, we've always learned that there is celebration over the one as it is for the thousand. And so I think in this program, it really has been about trying to serve everybody, but also celebrating that one household at a time, we are able to provide some hope and stability that wasn't there before.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So Brett, you've heard about how these federal resources have impacted our community over the short term over the past few months. What's the path forward? You showed your report at the beginning, and it was focused primarily on community development resources and the limited number of resources that have gone into our community over the years. Is there an optimistic picture for us in the future? Is the federal government going to invest more? What should we do locally to try to beat that drum to ensure that the types of resources that have been flooding our community over the past year and a half need to continue? Just give us some thoughts from where you sit there in DC at the Urban Institute.
Yeah, great questions, and commend the good and the quick work that has been done locally, and join those choruses of the amens, because it's important there. So thank you all. From a national perspective, on the one hand, I'm really heartened by what we've just been through, right? We went through a cataclysmic economic crisis, ones that anybody would have been challenged to imagine. And we did it, as work of my colleagues have shown, with poverty levels not going up and with food insecurity not going up. And we've been hearing locally about eviction prevention. And so to think that we can have that many million people lose their jobs and that we actually haven't had a lot of those dire outcomes is actually an incredible testimony. And how did we do it? Well, it's actually not a surprise, right? Like, the government spent money and it actually worked. So lo and behold, like, the government actually has power. It actually has the ability to make a difference, and it did make a difference. And this pandemic and this moment would look very different if we did not spend all of the resources that we did through 3 different stimulus bills and efforts. And so I think the hopeful or the optimistic lesson to take away from all of this is that government can work, and it actually can meet a lot of the needs that we're talking about. I think the challenge is, in terms of a future of, are we going to keep meeting the need if we're not seeing it as a crisis formed by a virus, but a crisis formed by centuries of wealth stripping, disinvestment, especially when we look at some communities and populations, especially by race. And so when we think about what the future needs to be, we're going to need a much more robust federal set of resources, so that it's not the case that 1 out of every 4 people who qualifies for a housing voucher is able to get it, for example. And so I think, a lot of attention right now in Washington is on infrastructure bill and on, jobs, what's coming in and what's going out of this current legislation, and is it 1.7 trillion or what is the final number we're going to get to. But all that to say, I think we will hopefully have some investments coming in, but I think in environments that are generally low tax, low spend states, where the states are not filling in a lot of the holes, we've also had a hollowing out at the federal level. Paul, I know that we've talked about this, right? But CDBG is currently 20% of its former peak. The home program is less than half, right? So we've had these one-time infusions, but but the underlying base level is actually not promising. The federal government used to be 17% of the money that local governments spend, and now it's like 3, 4, 5%. So the federal government's doing a lot less, exception COVID. And so what we need for a future is a really robust federal role, as well as state.
Yeah, I mean, and Brett, you hit on a big point, one that was really close to me when I was at HCD. In fact, I think that might have been the first time me and you ever talked last year when we were talking about CDBG specifically, and the fact that the city of Memphis allocation of roughly about $6.5 million a year is woefully below many of our peer cities. Which you look at the numbers, we're really close. I mean, Baltimore, which has roughly the same population and size, gets about $16-17 million a year in CDBG. Detroit gets $33 million a year. And what we came up with as a proposed solution, which I still believe is viable, is in order to prevent Detroit from losing money and Baltimore from losing money when they change the formula, they should revise the formula to bring parity and equity, but also dramatically increase the number of the allocation so that their numbers still go up, but ours go up dramatically so that we are on par, so that they don't lose money, but we all get more, because it's such an important thing for all of our communities because we rely on that. So Steve, I just want to come back to you and hear from you about the path forward. And Dorcas, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do we do to ensure that we are able to maintain collaboration like this for the same people that Dorcas just talked about? For those people that are community, what do we do as government, quasi-governmental, nonprofit agencies to maintain this type of momentum when the resources are lower?
Well, Dorcas promised me she was going to fight me today, so we got to make sure we get a fight going here. Maybe I can start the fight. No, I'm just kidding. We do disagree sometimes, and that's part of it. And that's part of my message to everybody is get ready to disagree and be uncomfortable and have uncomfortable conversations and to be wrong and to have your ideas, not the ideas that win the day, but stay involved anyway. We've all got to give in order to get some solutions that work. I think that the value of very close collaboration between foundations and nonprofits and government and community service agency is vital to our success. I don't think any single one of those can make it alone. This is not a simple technical problem that can be solved with a simple technical answer. These are complex challenges that face us in the future, that face us today, that face us before. And the only way to solve them is by having a lot of people working on it together with a sense of purpose and common vision, even if there are disagreements and different approaches. One of the challenges that I believe has been a challenge of the pandemic response programs has been the speed that the federal government went and deployed compared to the experience and historical successes and historical programmatic designs at the local level, which is what I know best. So when the federal government told us in December that we needed to spend $28 million by December of 2021, we, said we've never done that before. One of the things in the room that we had to talk about was, I quickly added up like what the total spending in 2019 was for the 5 or 6 agencies that deal with evictions. And I think it was maybe a couple million, maybe, program and grant money to help people, maybe a couple million for the whole city and county. And now we're supposed to spend $30 million by December of 2021. it's like, how do we do that? And I mean, that was one of the things that Dorcas and Paul and I talked about in kind of thinking through how are we going to set this up is, we can't assume that our existing staff doing the existing things that they're doing can also spend $28 million in a year when they've never done that before. And so I went into that in a little bit of detail because that is a part of the challenge that we've actually sort of faced, and we've begun to transition to I think that, the federal government guidance from Treasury for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program changed. They realized we're going to need to give people more time. And so it became a 4 or 5 year program, even while we were operating as a spend it by December 31st program. So there's been a bit of chaos in the rollout, which made it hard for us as partners to make something work. And so one of the transitions that we had to realize was we're going from an emergency program that was set up fast and designed to spend down by the end of the year to a multi-year program that needs a robust staff and everything else. And so going forward, I think what we have to do is maintain those close relationships, even if we have disagreements, find ways to work through those and stay committed to the mission together, and advocate together within our proper roles for the the ongoing support from the federal government for these kinds of housing needs. I think the way that we advocate for that is by helping people who don't understand begin to understand that stable housing is the foundation of everything else in our society. Successful educational programs, successful health, successful transportation design. If we don't have stable housing at the foundation, we can't succeed in the other areas. And so it pays off in so many other ways besides just the stability of one family and one house. It pays off in societal impact.
All right, Dorcas, same question. Like, what can we do to maintain this type of momentum on serving people in our community amongst the host of agencies that have been collaborating?
So I think Steve made a lot of good points. I mean, I think the one that I would really like that's significant to me is keeping the conversations going. The Memphis and Shelby County, we have a very complex government structure, right? We have lots of different elected officials and departments and divisions that are responsible for things that connect us all. Anytime I tell people, so the city runs the housing and community development, and they're like, well, what do y'all do in community services? And what does John Zena do in the Office of Planning and Development? There are lots of moving parts. And I think that what we have learned is that even if our structure does not promote us talking and collaborating, we have to do it. We have to challenge ourselves to work together to make sure that we are bringing people to the table on the front end and not on the back end. Just keep that going. I think the other thing, and I don't know, I will say this, I know we all like to celebrate what we've done well, and I pat the team on the back and celebrate the team that has been able to spend over $28 million already this year and serve people. But as we are thinking about how we go into this next phase of service, I think listening to the people is really important. It's been really difficult because we're trying to respond to this crisis that is happening to really understand how the residents on the street, how it impacts them. And so just doing a better job of hearing what things are working, what things are not working. When we do have abilities to have flexible funding. So the ERAP program was specifically for renters, and it was for rent and utilities. But as we get other funding in, really understanding what the needs really are and not just figuring that we know because we know, I think is going to be critical as we move forward. Because as we hear from our residents, we have power in a lot of different ways through government, through advocacy, to push on our federal government to direct resources to the areas that we really need them, right? And I think, I just think there's a lot of room for improvement there as we move forward. And I'm hopeful that, we will begin to integrate a lot of that as we continue to work together.
All right. And I'll open this up to any one of you all. And as I ask this question, if you all have questions in the chat, I see City Councilwoman Rhonda Logan asked a question. I kind of asked that question, the last question, in response to her question. But if there are others, please put them in the chat, and I'll make sure we get to them. But one question I have for either of you is, how do we get the private sector involved? When Brett gave his presentation at the beginning, when you're talking about capital flow, particularly downtown, which obviously I represent now, the reason the number is so dark is in that area and in East Memphis is because there is a private market in those areas. The private market actually works in those communities. And so the question is, how do we get private capital to flow into the areas where, the free market is not working as well in those neighborhoods? So I'd love to hear any of you guys that have thoughts on how we move the needle on that, giving private resources in those communities. David, I must have predicted
I'm sorry, I'm not the expert on this, so I'm looking forward to Fred or Steve answering. But I do think that we have opportunities to do a better job of helping the private sector understand the benefit of their investment in these areas. And there are some benefits that are, of course, it comes down to money, but people that are private investors are humans too, right? And so when you are part of the fabric of a community, of a city, like, there is something that connects you to that bigger picture. And so I think for me, I am always trying to find opportunities, as you can tell, to put a human spin on what we're doing and how investment can help that human connection. So that's one way, but I'm sure there's a much smarter answer out there as well.
That's a great start to the answer. One thing that I believe, and one of the reasons that I think nonprofits are an important element, is because we need to show what's possible without the profit motive, so that people with the profit motive can model and then make money. So there has to be somebody who jumps into the gap and does not have the profit motive, has more of the social change motive. And so that's kind of the whole reason that we have nonprofits in society, is so that you have somebody who's driven by something, not the profit motive. The profit motive isn't going to get us what we want, in my opinion, on its own. And so if we, as the nonprofit affordable housing providers who want quality housing, safe housing, access to transportation and schools and everything else, and we get in the breach there and say this works, to the tune of like 1% of the solution of the problem. Now we need 99 people to get in there and follow that lead. That's the way I think about it. We're just out there trying to demonstrate potential solutions, and then we want people to find ways to attract the private capital for deals that actually make money. And in the end, it's going to have to be a mix of both.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think what I'll just add is how big the solution needs to be. So I'm doing work to look at place-based redevelopment efforts across the country and to really change a neighborhood that's disinvested, and to bring it from a disinvested neighborhood to just like a regular invested middle majority white neighborhood within Memphis, or I'm looking in Baltimore or Atlanta and some of the others. we need about $500 million of investment into like one little census tract or two census tracts over the course of 20 years. And in truly, truly disinvested places, it's probably closer to $1 billion of investment in like one little neighborhood. And that's not to say we shouldn't try to do place-based work. It's to say that if we're in more middle market neighborhoods, you know, they'll need less than the like ones that don't have investor demand on their own. But when we look at, and I'm doing a separate study of the Choice Neighborhoods program and got picked up by this local article looking at the Choice Neighborhood Development, $30 million in Memphis. You know, 30 million is great. Like, it's really important. But you know, we're going to need 500 million if we're going to really change fundamentally a place that's going to have a developer where they want to put a grocery store and where they're going to put housing without having to have a whole lot of subsidy attached to that decision. And so the hard part is there's a lot of neighborhoods, you know, that could benefit from that help. And so we have too little resource and we also spread it around. And so we end up not fundamentally changing really any of the places that we're trying to support. So it's a challenge on the strategy level, it's a challenge on the resource level, but the private sector is not going to move until it has assurances that the market rents are going to support the activity that they're producing. And so if we don't have per square foot numbers on you know, commercial or industrial or what have you, it's going to be really hard to move the private market. So I agree, there is a role for the nonprofits, especially nonprofit community development finance organizations. Philanthropy can help by providing loan guarantees and subsidy. Public sector can help by putting in its subsidy and dollars and also providing loan guarantees or credit enhancement, loss reserves, what have you. So we have the tools, they're just not big enough to work everywhere. And our collective, and this is not a critique of any one person, and, you know, administrations change and philanthropies, you know, can be fickle and they can change, you know, whatever, it's all mixed in. The federal government can disappear, but it just means we don't have the staying power that of the 20 years that it takes to see about change in a place. So, so we have the answers, we just don't have enough of them.
Yeah, understood. And I know I'm supposed to ask questions, but your comments just kind of inspired me because it made me think about the South City redevelopment project, which it was a Choice Neighborhoods project, and the $30 million number was just what the city put in, which I think ultimately ended up being $34 million. And it was matched by $30 million from HUD, but it was ultimately a $250 million project. With a lot of that support coming from THDA in the form of LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. And so, you know, it really, and that's not a large area. And so when you look at the challenges that we have before us, I think it is a very, very large goal that we have to redevelop and redefine our neighborhoods and communities, but it's one that I think our community is up to task for. It's just a matter of us continuing to be thoughtful about how we apply the limited funds we have and continuing to build capacity, because at the end of the day, we need more than just, you know, 4 or 5 strong nonprofits working in the markets where, you know, the development community hadn't necessarily gotten. We need 20 to 30 nonprofits able to operate in those areas and develop and create markets in those areas where they are not as strong. And, you know, for me, it's really just about us being relentless. And I think that's the word, is relentless. We can't give up. And I really deep down believe that why can't Memphis be the one to figure this thing out? Every city in the country is struggling with this. But I believe that we have the right people here to actually make this happen. We're getting close to the end. I wanted to circle back to Juanita Hamilton, who is representing THDA. Before I get to Juanita, I want to give some closing remarks, to just some closing words from Dorcas, Steve, and Brett, if you guys could quickly give a 30-second wrap up from you all.
So I'll go first and I'll be short and sweet. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to come and share. This is not the end. Shelby County Community Services, we are committed to being part of the solution. That is going to require hard work, but it's also going to require a lot of heart. And I think we have both. And I am happy that we will continue this conversation and service with you all. So thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I greatly appreciate the leadership that the city and the county government that's represented by Paul and Dorcas especially that made it possible for us to do innovative things fast. I want to encourage everybody to stay with it. Stay the course. The perseverance is really one of the main things that's going to help us get through some of these challenges. We're going to try things that don't work. We're going to work with people we can't work with well and find a better way to do it. But sticking with it and staying true to the vision of a better country that has solid, stable housing for all citizens is worth the pain along the way.
Thank you, Steve. Brett.
Just following in those steps, I think all I'll add is I'm cheering you on and happy to be a resource in whatever way possible. So keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. And Juanita, you have the difficult job of following all of these amazing people, but you are equally amazing. So why don't you close us out and speak on behalf of TXDA for us?
All right, well, thank you. And I'm glad that I was asked to do the introductions, although I had technical difficulties and now my battery's about to go low. So I had to get my charger out. But this was a great session. One thing that I really took away from the session is the word collaboration. A lot of times I was with the city for 21 years. A lot of times we do things in our silo and we think that even though HCD is its own silo, we get together with the people we need to, but to see the program, I briefly worked with the emergency rental program when it first started. I worked with some other CARES Act funding, Housing Trust Fund, and just to see the collaboration of the people inside of HCD and outside of HCD in the county, nonprofits, I think that it does stretch. It helps the resources go a little bit further. And I think another thing is that you have to be willing to do what you need to do. So, volunteering to do something that you may not have done or offering your resources. If you can't do it, if you've got funding that can help, or, you've got a process. I know with the one of the rental programs, I volunteered for our department to process the payments because I knew that we could, but that helped. We helped a lot of people with their mortgage and rent payments to, be able to stay in their homes as well. So I think collaboration amongst, government, nonprofits, citizens, anyone who has resources and knowledge that can help. So this was a great session. I learned a lot, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry I didn't get to read your bios, but I think you guys, you did a great job, and what you talked about kind of told us what was in the bio as I was hearing you and remembering what was in them. So I thank you for the time and hope everyone's is enjoying the summit. And I think we have another session coming up after this. So hope everyone's having a great afternoon. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We will consider ourselves dismissed.